Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you. We are now in July. It is the day before the 4th of July, of course. That would be tomorrow. Possibly more exciting to people on my social media feeds today was the fact that Hamilton came out on Disney+. I have a friend who posted that her girls, who are 11 and 13, woke her up at 2 a.m. so they could watch it. And yes, she had to work today, but she's a very sweet mama and she watched it with them. I don't know if I could have stayed awake. I had to confess that I have not actually seen Hamilton, nor have I ever listened to the soundtrack. I've heard bits and pieces of it here and there, but I've never listened to the soundtrack, and I have not had an occasion to see it. So I did not watch it today, unlike many, many people in the world, but I will watch it at some point, possibly this weekend. My husband, despite loving musicals and history, doesn't really want to watch it, so I don't know. Maybe I'll watch it by myself. Maybe I'll try to talk him into it. We'll just have to see. But Hamilton aside, I do have another author interview for you. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, we do have the theme of serial killer going on again here, but that's not the main focus of this book as it was in the last book. This is more from the investigative side. And there are some horror elements, some supernatural elements, and there are historical fiction elements. So the book is called Lake of Darkness. The author is Scott Kenemore, and the description is as follows. During the First World War, on the south side of Chicago, Officer Joe Flippity has begun an investigation into a serial decapitationist who is hunting young children. At a time when African American officers are rendered second class by prejudicial policies, Flip is nonetheless called upon by the mayor of the city, the legendary Big Bill Thompson himself, and a host of powerful city fathers to thwart this murderer who threatens to destroy the city's reputation as a safe haven for those making the great migration north. While searching to catch his killer and to discover why the most powerful men in Chicago are truly concerned about the murders of poor black refugees, Flip's bloody trail takes him through the South Side's vice districts, where anything is available for a price, across its most dangerous criminal underbellies, and into a bracing and unexpected world of supernatural horror. As Flip digs deeper in his quest to protect the city's most vulnerable, he stumbles upon more mysterious murders, confounding psychological puzzles, and terrifying hints of something other that may reach across from unknowable distances to guide the hand of a killer. It soon becomes apparent that all is not what it seems, and that mysterious and powerful forces are conspiring to stand in Flip's way. A combination of detective thriller, cosmic horror, and historical fiction, Lake of Darkness takes us to the deepest and darkest places in Chicago's very dark history. Now, depending on how much you may or may not know about Chicago's history, I mean, Chicago has a really, really interesting and messy history, I guess maybe you'd want to call it, especially political wise. But it is a fascinating history, and this book takes place, as it says, during the First World War. So you've got that happening in the world, but you've also got this great migration north that's happening from the deep south to Chicago. You have this whole group of people trying to build a better life for themselves and their families. And as most situations where there are large groups of refugees moving somewhere new, it can cause conflict. But what is happening here is, as it said, a serial decapitationist, which is really hard to read when you're reading a sentence out loud, I discovered. Not to make light of it, though. So it's a very horrible situation for a group of very vulnerable people, vulnerable because they're refugees, vulnerable because they are Black, in a time when that is very, very unacceptable for a lot of people. Scott does a great job of exploring the cultural and societal nuances of this time and this place. And, I love historical fiction. Not as huge of a fan of horror, but hey, when you combine it with historical fiction, I'll go there. And this wasn't too bad on my horror scale. I should actually create a horror scale, at least for myself. I'll have to think about that, because I'm always saying I don't usually like horror, but this book had X, Y, and Z. So this book, in addition to the horror and the supernatural elements, also had a really compelling cast of characters, had some great looks into Chicago's South Side during this point in history. And, I always like to read murder mysteries or mysteries in general where the technology is not like what we have today. And obviously the technology during the time of the First World War was vastly different from what we have today. So I really enjoyed that. Let's go ahead now and turn to the interview with Scott. Again, the novel is called Lake of Darkness, and the author is Scott Kenemore.
Hello, Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am excited to have you here. We are here to talk about your new novel. It's called Lake of Darkness. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So my name is Scott Kenemore. I'm a writer living in the Chicagoland area. Since 2004, I lived in Chicago, and a few years ago, I fell in love and got married. And one of the things that happened with that is I moved in with my wife, who lives in a suburb north of, so I'm not technically Chicagoan anymore. I live in Evanston, which is a very nice city, one town north. I'm mostly known for doing creative writing about zombies. I have a whole sort of series of horror novels about zombies. But I also write sometimes just straight ghost stories, horror stories, and that's sort of what this new novel, Lake of Darkness, is.
Yeah, so that's a lovely segue. Can you give an overview of Lake of Darkness?
Yeah, sure. So it's about a serial killer decapitationist who is stalking the south side of Chicago during World War I, a little over 100 years ago. And specifically sort of the neighborhoods that I used to work in, starting, from between about 2004 to 2010, I worked in community development on the south side of Chicago, specifically for organizations that were sort of like fighting the history of redlining, if you're familiar with that. So I would learn just these fascinating backstories about what the city was like 100 years ago, how the politics were different, how the people were different, how the neighborhoods and physical buildings were different. And then just I'd always sort of wanted to construct a horror story set in that world. And it took me sort of a long time to figure out how it could work, a lot of sort of like plotting and planning over the years. But it's about sort of what it was like to be an African-American police officer back then, because the police really I always say like Chicago can seem very progressive on paper, because they had, black officers since like the Civil War, and they were a leader in hiring police matrons who were sort of like proto-female officers. And historians think Chicago hired the first African-American female police officer in the history of the United States in the early 1910s. But you scratch that surface and you find that, for a lot of years, including the era I'm writing about, like black officers didn't even get uniforms. It was just like, here's a badge and a gun. And yet there were all these sort of like civil rights inflection points, sort of where things would change, and they would sort of say, okay, black cops are going to get white partners, and black cops are going to patrol neighborhoods that aren't just majority African-American neighborhoods. So it was just like such an interesting time of change. And there are lots of books about it in the history section, the Chicago history section, but not that many works of fiction. So that was what made it exciting for me to sort of like jump in and give that a try.
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating point in history. I mean I think Chicago is pretty fascinating in its history at many different points in history.
Yeah.
So that was your inspiration for the historical aspect of it. What was your inspiration for the fiction part of the story?
Sure. Well, I love detective stories, and I love whodunits. And I love horror. I'm a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, big fan of uncanny horror. And I always like detective stories where the detective is sort of like working in a world that is slightly absurd. Like I really like. There's a contemporary novelist named Martin Cruz Smith who has a whole series of novels about a Russian detective named Arkady Renko. They're like 9 novels or something. But the novels start during the Soviet era, so he's like trying to solve crimes with the absurdity of the Soviet system, and now under Putin. So like an example would be in the Soviet years, detectives or police generally were not allowed to arrest prostitutes for prostitution because the state party line went, glorious Soviet communist system has solved prostitution because we have 100% employment in the Soviet Union. Anyone can go to the government to get a job. So prostitution doesn't exist. Why would you be a prostitute? And what they don't tell you is the jobs that anyone can get through the government are like cleaning fish in Siberia for $2 an hour. So they're horrible. And many people would prefer to be a sex worker than do something like that. But consequently, when the police would get a call from a business owner, say, hey, there are a bunch of prostitutes milling out in front of my business, driving away customers, would you ask them to move along? They would have to say, like, we're going to arrest you for loitering or littering. They have to come up with something else because you don't want to be the one to say, oh, I arrested a prostitute, which means glorious communist Soviet system maybe isn't working the way the government wants it to. So I always, So I love stories of good people trying to do the right thing, but in worlds of absurdity like that. And Chicago, for better or worse, mostly worse, 110 years ago, had a lot of absurdities like that a cop would have to deal with. So I wanted definitely to explore that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it is just fascinating, and this is my second interview this weekend about serial killers. So,
oh, cool.
Don't know how I feel about that, but
let me know how I stack up when this is done.
Well, they're very different. One's contemporary, one is historical fiction. So,
right.
The book it has a black protagonist and is mainly has mainly black characters. So can you talk a little bit about writing black characters as a white author?
Yeah, sure. So like definitely like my book publicist, when we were talking about PR for that, we had like an American Dirt meeting, like, Scott, like, is this okay for you to have done? But I know I think just about anybody can write from a perspective if they are doing so from a place of thoughtfulness and care and their own firsthand knowledge. And so, again, I spent 6 years, 40, 50 hours a week working in fair housing, fighting redlining on the South Side, and just getting to know so much about the city and so much about the city's history. I've written novels with non-white characters before. I realized if I wanted to tell this story about this community that I knew so well and where I spent so much time, and I wanted to tell it during this inflection point when things were changing, it wasn't going to be the case. Not all, but most of the characters would be African American. So, I think I don't have a secret key or touchstone of how to do that correctly, other than just to write what you physically know from physically being places, and to do so with thoughtfulness and care, and to be open to, if someone points out a way you could be more correct or could have done something in a way that might have been even more apt for the situation, to be open to that.
So now that you've got a better understanding of what this book is about and what inspired Scott to write it, we're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the process of writing this book, especially as a white author with mainly black characters. And so stay tuned. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about writing this novel with mainly black characters from the perspective of being a white author. And I thought of something during the break that I've had a few questions from people about, and that is why I, as a white podcaster, tend to say black as often as or more than I say African American. And the answer to that is that my husband is black, and he almost never uses African American. And so having been with him for 10 years now, that's just kind of come into my vernacular. I notice that I say it a lot more than I do say African American, although I use them both. So yeah, that's just a little personal anecdote and explanation from the podcaster's point of view, but we are here for Scott's point of view more than mine. So let's go ahead and return now to the interview. Again, I'm speaking with Scott Kenemore about his novel, Lake of Darkness.
Yeah, and did you have black beta readers or anything like that?
I've had some African American people in the editorial staff have read it. I had one Native American friend read it because there is a historical character who uses the R word that is an NFL team, and I was like, but also it's like I feel of two minds about that, because if you write a book that is thoughtless and runs on crude stereotypes and is not researched and does not involve any firsthand knowledge on your part, you can find a bunch of people who are not your race or ethnicity to have read it, but I don't know that would exonerate it from being lousy and lazy. And I think for me that really the sin when you're a writer is laziness, is not wanting to have to deal with the nuances that are often present in this kind of a project. And I'm not sure if I did it perfectly, but I think you do the best you can do, and you try not to be lazy, and you try to be open to correction and suggestion.
Sure. Yeah, and so some of the white characters in the book, there aren't many, but the majority of them, I would say, are actual historical figures. So the
right.
main one being Big Bill Thompson, who was the mayor at the time. Can you talk talk a little bit about Bill Thompson and his place in Chicago's history?
Yeah, so he was a real lovable scoundrel, and most people, if they know him as the mayor during the Al Capone years. But maybe it's part of why I like being a writer is I always like looking for the thing that people don't know. And his period of I guess his first terms as mayor before the Capone era were also just really, really interesting and sort of full of like different kinds of corruption. You sort of like got to watch him getting his sea legs. And so for me, it's sort of like the prequel to Capone, the World War I era. But he was a fascinating guy. So he was the son of a wealthy and powerful Chicago family, but he loved the Wild West in the late 1800s, like the dying days of the Wild West. And so he would go out to Nebraska whenever he could and just sort of live as a cowboy and like shoot guns and raise and rope broncos and get into bar fights. This is well documented. And his parents were afraid he was going to like run away entirely. So they worked out a deal with him that if he would come back to Chicago 3 months of the year and take business classes, they would support him living as a cowboy in Nebraska. And then the test, the moment of truth comes when his father dies, and he has to decide: do I come to Chicago and take over the sort of family empire? Do I stay a cowboy in Nebraska my whole life? So he comes to Chicago, and he sort of lives like a sort of like a proto frat guy. Gets a house within the Vice District called the Levy District, and sort of carouses with other young men his age. Doesn't act too seriously. And then the famous story is one night at a bar, he and his friends had learned that the local alderman, which is like a city councilman in Chicago, was not running for re-election. And one of his friends put $50 on the table, which would be like $1,000 or $2 today, and said, you know, Bill, $50 says you won't run for that spot. And Bill was like, I'm going to take your money. And he ran for alderman and won, and sort of started his path to power there. And it's interesting that like he at his age, he was called Big Bill Thompson initially because he was tall and athletic, but by the end of his life he was 300 pounds. And he was big because he was just very overweight. And his girth sort of increased with his political power, which I found fascinating. So like by his own admission, that first running for office, running for alderman, starting his career, he gained 14 pounds doing that. And the reason was because the way you ran for office, you know, pre-radio, pre-television, was you went to taverns and you went to restaurants and talked to people. And the whole time you're eating and drinking. So go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, after your initial description, I had to Google him and look up what this man looked like, because I was pretty sure I'd heard the name, but I couldn't put a face with it at that point. So I Googled him.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of interesting political scoundrels in Chicago's history, and a lot of people know a couple of corrupt aldermen. One called Bathhouse John Coughlin, who ran bathhouses, and another one named Hinky Dink Kenna, and they were sort of like friends and worked together in corruption schemes. And a lot of people know Capone, but I feel like Big Bill is sort of like the missing link from the Bathhouse John and Hinky Dink era to Capone. So he's just like a really fascinating character who's like, you know, a 50% like literal Wild West, like Al Swearingen mayor type, and then 50% sort of like a proto-contemporary politician who, as you see in the book, was like very known for like slicing and dicing different demographics and sort of like designing things. So he always came out ahead in the end, and he served his friends and his base in the end. So he's sort of a central character, let's say. I don't want to give too much away.
Right. Yeah, he does play an important role.
Yeah, and then just to close out that subject, another character is an Italian policeman named Crespo in the book, and there really was, as I talk about in the story, a group of extortionists around the year 1900 in Chicago called the Black Hand Squad, who were famous for mostly they would prey on members of the Italian community, but you just get a letter one day that said like, hello, we're the Black Hand Squad. You've been tapped. We're going to need, you know, the equivalent today would be like $10,000. We need $10,000 in a month or so, or we're just going to kill you. And they killed 10 to 20 Chicagoans a year. And they would usually, when they killed you, they would leave your body somewhere conspicuous. Like they would dump it at a busy intersection with a knife in your back and like a note claiming credit. So it was like you either were going to pay or you were going to become advertising for their horrible reign of terror. And the city, in sort of a rare show of competence, created this squad of police officers called the Black Hand Squad. And the rule was, to be a member, you yourself had to be an immigrant from Italy or the son of immigrants. And it worked really, really effectively. And the reason sort of that's mentioned in my story is I think, you know, then as now, people within groups are always going to have better luck fighting crime within those groups. And I think that it's something that police departments in the early 20th century sort of were noticing. Like if there's a crime problem in the Italian American community, for example, we're going to be looking to maybe Italian American officers will help us solve this. And I know, during my time living in Chicago, starting in 2004, the police department has made big busts of serious crime rings in the Chinese American community with undercover operations. And, those officers were not white or black or Latino. Those were Chinese American officers who did that work. And I think that, is always to some extent going to be true.
Yeah, so I would imagine that that aspect of history maybe kind of gave you your jumping off point for Flip's character. Joe Flippity is
right.
his name. It's called Flip.
Yep.
And they bring him in as an African-American officer to solve
right.
this series of serial killings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Grisly serial, not just serial killing, Sarah.
No, really, really disturbing serial killing.
Yeah, disturbing.
I laugh because otherwise I will go, yeah. So you've already got the historical fiction aspect and you've already got the detective thriller aspect of the book. Why then go that third step and add in sort of the horror aspect of it?
Yeah, I am a big fan of horror. I love horror, and I think a big question you get from people is like, why do you like scary stuff? And it's a genre to write or just to read that a lot of people will sort of when you mention that you're into it, will make that sort of sound like Beavis and Butthead being discussed. Like they just they're really disturbed by you having an interest in that. And so that to me is an interesting question of what is appealing about reading about a horror tale, something that is horrifying. And having thought a lot about this question, I think my answer is I like horror because it makes you reevaluate things that you could be wrong about. It makes you ask, like, is there something about which I could be mistaken in my life? Because almost all horror involves main characters realizing they have been mistaken about something. So it can be as simple as, I'm very sure that this bunker I've built is 100% zombie proof, and there's no way they're going to get in. But sort of on a deeper level, I think it can be people feel like, well, ghosts are, that's something humans came up with when times were more primitive and they didn't have technology and they still thought the world was flat. So of course they're a there's no reason to think that these things exist in all cultures and all backgrounds and all places, because maybe there's something to them. No, it must be the case that they're superstition. It's Mary Shelley, like there's no way we could use this new galvanizing technology to bring a human back from the dead or construct a human from corpse parts in the graveyard. That couldn't happen. And in almost all good horror stories, there's that moment of, gosh, I was really sure that couldn't happen, but I guess it could happen. And there's this moment of having been wrong about something. And I think it is an interesting sensation when you're reading horror or anything else to realize that this work has made me think about, am I completely sure about everything that I'm sure about? And, it's like I think to myself, like I am, in addition to writing novels, I have a day job in corporate communications by day. And when the last presidential election happened, I was working at sort of like a very hip Gen Y tech company in downtown Chicago. And a lot of people the day after Election Day came to work, and they were very distraught by what had happened. And I think it was more than, they wanted their candidate to win, but, what a surprise. It didn't look like he had the polls, but it turns out he did. And we have a different president than we thought we would. There was another aspect to it. And, I had a colleague who was, now and again having to get up from her desk to go and vomit in the bathroom. And I thought to myself, there is an element of horror here, right? It's not just the case that we thought one candidate would win. All the polls said candidate A, but it's candidate B, right? It was the fact that we felt certain this could not happen. And something that we thought we knew for sure could not happen has indeed happened. And when people ask me, is horror relevant? I say, yes, I think it is for reasons like that.
It's time for another break. As I was listening to Scott talk about horror and how it is relevant to everyday life, I found myself nodding and agreeing and thinking, yeah, that makes total sense. And so maybe this is why I'm learning to have more of an appreciation for horror, because I am recognizing that connection. I don't know. Or maybe just because I keep having to read it for the podcast and just getting more comfortable with reading it and more used to reading it, whereas I would avoid it at all costs before. Let's take that break. When we come back, we will be talking more about writing horror and what draws people to horror in general. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Scott was speaking about why he likes to write horror, why he thinks people are drawn to horror, and we are going to continue that conversation a little as we get back to the interview.
I also think that sometimes we're drawn to reading and or watching horror, not writing it necessarily, but watching it because we like to feel sort of smug sitting on our couches thinking, I wouldn't do that, or I'd be more prepared than that, or
that's a really great observation. And I remember once complimenting a horror writer whose novel I had enjoyed, and I was trying to tell him why I liked it so much. And I think I said, because at every juncture when the main character was making decisions, I thought to myself, yeah, I would have done that. Yeah, I would have done that. Okay, and if that happened, I would do that. And then I would be dead. And then this disaster would have happened.
Yes, pretty much. How much research did you do for the book?
So lots and lots is the short answer. One of the questions is what counts as research. So I as a writer, I'm sort of always just interested in the environments that I travel to or that I work in, and I think, would I like to set a story here? Is there something spooky that I could use one day? So again, just like when you're working on the south side of Chicago and you're looking at a 3-flat that you're going to sell, and what's the history of this building and the history of the neighborhood, I would just sort of accidentally end up doing research that would make me learn just like fascinating stuff about the background of the city in terms of where businesses had been located, how different demographic groups had moved around or had not moved around, and that sort of research just more or less like kind of came naturally. But the other folks I should mention are I read a lot of books by this team of reporters who wrote a lot of history books about Chicago, sort of mid-century. In the 20th century, their names were Went and Kogan. One was a reporter for the Tribune, the other for the Sun-Times. And they have a book about Bill Thompson called Big Bill of Chicago. It was just incredibly valuable. But I read almost all of their stuff. And then I also, it's important for me to mention a historian who's still alive named Timuel Black, who has a series called Bridges of Memory about the Great Migration specifically. I think he's 101 now, but no living historian has done more firsthand interviews with people who made the Great Migration to Chicago. So it's so many wonderful firsthand accounts of like, what was it like to come to Chicago from the Deep South in 1920 in 1930, trying to get a job, trying to get housing, and how that worked for you. And his stuff is just so super interesting and valuable. So definitely Timuel Black pulled on his work a lot.
That sounds really fascinating, actually. And I appreciated that you started the book that way, with describing the Great Migration, so that you got a little bit of that background and understanding of what the times were for the African American community.
Yeah, I think some readers naturally have a good familiarity with what that was, and others, it might be new to them. So you give some background, and there's so many great books you can read if you want to know more.
There are two secondary characters, but who play a fairly significant role, Sally and Tark.
Yes.
I would imagine that they were kind of fun to research and write.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll work separately. So Sally is a madam at a house of prostitution in the story. And I was moved to include her because so Chicago had this vice district for many years that was just beginning to end, beginning to wind down in the period I'm writing about. But it was called the Levee District, and the city had sort of just decided, if we can keep it within the certain borders of certain blocks, we're just going to allow opium dens and gambling and sex work and illegal taverns where anything goes on, and just sort of like regulate it. And those gentlemen I talked about before, Bathhouse John Coughlin and Hinky Dink Kenna, they were famously the aldermen who sort of supervised the vice district. And one of the reasons I was interested in writing about it, particularly in a book where I'm writing mostly African American characters, is because in researching it, I sort of learned that just as there was that sense of like, here in the vice district, we're not playing when it comes to laws. Like you shouldn't be able to sell opium and sell sex and have gambling, but we're not playing. It's different here. So too were they sort of not playing when it came to some of the problematic, bigoted aspects of what life was like 110 years ago. So having, a black person be the boss of a white crew, that went on in the Levee District. Having women own and run businesses, that went on in the Levee District. And in an era when women, didn't have many roads to wealth and power, right? It was very hard for a woman to become a surgeon or a stockbroker or the mayor. Lots of women opened up vice-based businesses and did very well for themselves. The most famous instance is there was a house of prostitution called the Everleigh Club, run by these two sisters. And adjusting for inflation, some historians think they made about $100 million over the course of their career in 2020.
Wow.
Right. So it has two sides to it, because you say, there weren't that many engines of economic opportunity for women back then. And what does it say that this was? You had to go into this other world, this outer world, where we sort of weren't playing by the rules in good ways and maybe bad ways, to have that kind of opportunity. So I was really, really interested to write a character who had to live and survive in that world. The other character you mentioned, the amazing Drexel Tark, is a African American magician. And one thing you learn, not just about Chicago 100 years ago, but still today, there are a lot of African American circuses that travel around. And 100 years ago, it was because the mainstream circuses were often segregated, and there was racism regarding who could or couldn't attend. But even today, there are a few just all black circuses that tour around. So I was interested in having a performer sort of in that world who's thinking about, what would it be like to travel? What would your career aspirations be? Where do you go from here? Are you waiting for times to change when you think of where you might move your act? That was a lot of research just read to that, and the way it worked in the plot of the book, I thought I needed to have that character.
Yeah, definitely for the plot of the book, I agree, and I don't want to give anything away. I always like to know, are there autobiographical elements in the book? In a book like this, I'm hoping you're not a serial killer, but are there?
No. I probably of any book I've written, this is the one where it is the least autobiographical, where it would be the most difficult for me to say one character is noticeably me. Yeah, I think it's not a very autobiographical book, except for the fact that I'm writing about neighborhoods and places and sometimes, city blocks where I spent a lot of time and got to know how they were, different or still the same 105 years ago.
One thing that I enjoy about historical fiction is the fact that even just 100 years ago, technology was so vastly different. I mean, even 20 years ago, technology was so vastly different. So
yes.
Doing detective work without, not even radio terribly popular yet. So doing this detective work, at one point they're looking through newspapers, looking through newspapers.
Yeah.
No index, no microfiche, no phones, none of that. So that is a fascinating look, I think.
Yeah, they were really, if you read Sherlock Holmes stories, it was more or less the same sort of technology a character like Sherlock Holmes would have had. And it was an interesting period also because, they knew a lot of stuff was coming but was not quite there yet. So, radio, for example, I think was a lot the way we might think about, self-driving cars today. Like we know they're coming, but they're not quite here yet. So people knew what radio was. They knew, I'm going to have a thing in my house that just talks to me, but it wasn't quite there yet.
Yep. The book ends in a way that makes me think there could be more with Joe. Is that a possibility?
I wasn't planning on making it a series or having sequels when I wrote it, but this is the last book of mine that my father read before he passed away. He read a very early draft, and he'd never sort of said this before, but he said you should do a series with Flip and Sally, and with his feedback. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how it sells. In publishing, they say you're only as good as your last book, and I don't know if books that came out during the height of COVID, like mine did, are going to get sort of a pass of not having that initial bump because half the bookstores are still closed and everything is crazy. But never say never. We'll totally see what happens and what my publisher wants to do, and I might get a new idea. So we will see.
Sounds good. What then are you working on now?
So I am just starting my next project, what I think will be my next project, and I don't want to give too much away, but it's something I've never done before, which is space horror, outer space horror. So it would be something like the movie Alien or Philip K. Dick's Maze of Death or Event Horizon, but something about the claustrophobic nature of horror happening in outer space is something I want to explore. And I think I have an idea that will be pretty cool and that people will like. So I'm just sort of beginning to tinker with that, which will probably be my next novel.
Okay, thank you. Are there any of your other novels that you would like to highlight at this point? I know you have the zombie series, and I find it fascinating that they're all zombie, state, like they're actual towns in.
Yeah, so I like to write about places I know or have lived. So I have a sort of zombie trilogy of Zombie Ohio, Zombie Illinois, and Zombie Indiana, and those are all states where I've lived for at least 4 years. But just briefly, Zombie Ohio comes from sort of my love of old film noir movies, and there's a great film noir called DOA from I think 1950 or something, where this fedored gangster guy walks into an old-timey police station and says, I'm here to report a murder. And they say, okay, whose? And he says, mine. Because he's learned he's just been poisoned and has 18 hours to live. So he's going to use those 18 hours to solve his own murder. So the plot of Zombie Ohio is a college professor dies in a car accident during a zombie outbreak when he's maybe trying to get away from some zombies. And he comes back, is reanimated himself as sort of a highly intelligent zombie who he has no memory of who he used to be, but he can sort of understand what's going on, can sort of speak. So he realizes gradually that the car accident he was in was not organic and that his brake lines were cut. So he realizes I've been murdered, and he's wondering who was I? What kind of guy was I that someone wanted to murder me? So he tries to use his zombie afterlife to solve his own murder. So that's probably the novel I'm best known for, actually, is Zombie Ohio.
Okay, that is funny and fascinating all at once. You just don't think of zombies solving their own murders.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Like you think about a zombie. Zombies are always a virus, right? Someone's got the zombie virus, but you learn about like with HIV disease, there are some people who get HIV, but it never makes them sick. So they have it, they can give it to other people, but just through like a random mutation, like 1 in every 50,000 carriers, just like never become unwell. So I was thinking about, what if that was the case with a zombie? Someone gets the zombie virus, they're reanimated, but for them, they don't lose their mind. They're still able to think and sort of speak normally, or they could pass as a human if they wanted to, that sort of thing. So yeah, just those are the weird kind of ideas that make you go, I should be a fiction writer. I should write this thing.
Yeah, well, and speaking of that segues nicely into my next question of when did you start writing? Is it something that you always wanted to do in terms of writing fiction?
Yeah, I've always liked creative writing. It's always been something I wanted to do. I went to creative writing camps in high school. I attended Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, which is a school with a very strong creative writing program. I mean, just my class year, we have John Green, the best-selling YA author in the world. We have Brooke Hauser, who writes biographies and is a magazine editor. We have Chris O'Cook, I think one of the best living poets. We have Dan Torday, who has written for Esquire and has like a couple of really great novels out, wins like Jewish Book Awards. We have Scott Kenemore, who's a big investigative reporter, was like on the Dr. Oz show and that's just the class of 2000. That's just my class. So it's a very, very strong creative writing school. And then the end of the answer is I went to Columbia and got an MFA there. And I just always like to write. And to be around writers is fun and inspiring.
All right, time for the last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Scott Kenemore.
Do you then have advice for aspiring authors?
I can talk about the things that I learned. I guess one thing would be you may not know what inspires you. And you may need to experiment, and that's okay. And the things that inspire and work for other people might not always work for you, and that's okay. I know some people who need to be around like violence and chaos, to be in the mood to write something violent and chaotic. And other people need like a quiet room and like absolutely no distractions at all. And just everybody's different. So, I would say definitely just like learn what works for you and experiment. I can remember when I was a grad student in New York City, I would like take a pad of paper and like this expensive pen someone had given me, and I would go watch the sunset and write in Riverside Park, and think to myself, this will be so inspiring. Like I'll come up with something awesome in this beautiful environment in front of me with this fancy pen. And like looking back, it was just asinine, and I should have been mugged and had my pen taken, and I did not need to be in that kind of environment. But I was a younger writer and I was experimenting, and I think I'm lucky. I've found that I can sort of make the magic trick happen just about anywhere. When COVID isn't going on, most mornings I take the Chicago CTA subway train into the downtown area called the Loop, and I do most of my writing just on the train every morning. Because I've figured out how to do that. But I would just say learn that about yourself, and what works for another writer might not work for you, and like that's totally fine. That's totally cool. So just find your own path.
Thank you. When you read for yourself, what authors and genres do you gravitate toward?
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question. No, but it's a good question. So I would say probably 50% of what I read is horror. My favorite author is definitely H.P. Lovecraft, but I like a lot of other sort of uncanny, weird writers in his sphere. I like people like Manly Wade Wellman. I like Thomas Ligotti. There's a lot of like sort of non-horror but horror-ish writers. I like Cormac McCarthy. Like nobody calls him a horror writer, but he's frequently horrifying. I like Philip K. Dick a lot. I like Stephen King. I like a writer from upstate New York who passed away in the 1980s named John Gardner. I like Clive Barker a lot. Clive Barker's like, I'll tell you my Clive Barker story, which is big fan of Clive. And I love this novel he wrote called Mr. Be Gone, which is like not one of his, it's not, like Hellraiser or one of his bigger books, but I just love it. So I met Clive at a horror convention in Florida a few years ago, and I was talking to him, and I was like, it's this book you wrote is like, Mr. Be Gone. I just love it so much. It's such a big deal to me, and just wanted to introduce myself. and he said sort of like very secretly, I'll tell you a secret about this character. And like he told me that one of the characters in the book was gay, who is not, explicitly said in the book, but I walked away thinking like, wow, like Clive Barker just told me this amazing secret. And then I sort of walked around the corner from where he was, and I think maybe I was like texting a friend, like I just heard a secret from Clive Barker, and I without really meaning to, found myself eavesdropping on his conversation with the next person talking to him. And I heard him say, I'll tell you a secret. And I realized that was just an expression he used. Was like, I'll tell you a secret. So to me, I'm like, I'm going to say something now. But I was
right.
like, oh, I don't have a secret Clive Barker secret that no one has. But I later I was thinking about it, and I thought maybe he does that to give everybody the gift he gave me, so that everybody who talks to him is excited like I was to go text a friend to tell them that Clive Barker just told them a secret. OMG. So looking at it that way sort of made me feel better.
Yes, I can understand. I know you have a website, so if you can tell people where to find your website as well as where they can interact with you on social media.
Yes, my website is uncreatively scottkenemore.com. And my Twitter handle is uncreatively at Scott Kenemore. And I have Facebook. I am generally published by Skyhorse Publishing. So if you want to write me a snail mail letter, send it to Skyhorse and they will forward it to me. And my email is on my website. So I'm pretty contactable, for better or worse.
All right. Well, I mean, creative is great, but it's easier to find you if you can just type in Scott Kenemore and not have to, figure out what clever handle you've come up with. So Scott, we've talked about the book and we've talked about a lot of different aspects of writing, et cetera, but is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to mention at this point?
I would just say sign off with support your local bookstore during this time, because I know it's tough. I mentioned I live in a little town now north of Chicago called Evanston, and we had 5 bookstores before COVID, and we're already down to 3. Like the Barnes and Noble just closed. So I like a lot of writers think that something is fundamentally fun and magical about browsing in a bookshop. So I'd ask you, when it is safe and when the government says it's okay, to really make sure that we support physical bookshops again when all this is over and it's safe again. So.
Well, and even now you can most likely order from your local bookstore, depending on.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of them some will even do deliveries, I understand, if you call them. So,
yep.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Anything you can do.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was totally fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again to Scott for joining me to talk about this novel, Lake of Darkness, as well as some of his other zombie-themed novels. I don't know why it intrigues me so much that he named them Zombie Indiana, Zombie Ohio, etc. I don't know, it kind of makes me want to read them just for that reason alone, which makes no sense. I mean, you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, and here I am just kind of wanting to read a book by its title. I don't know. At any rate, plus, the description that Scott gave of Zombie Ohio seems really fascinating. I mean, a zombie trying to solve his own murder. Not something you read every day. At any rate, thank you to Scott. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do follow us on social media and also give us a review. It helps us out so much if you can give us a 5-star review or a written review, and it can help us to get this podcast out to other book lovers like yourself. And maybe we can encourage people like me to read more horror. I don't know. Help me out. You can also, as I said, follow us on social media, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. A reminder to join me again on Tuesday when I will be speaking with Catherine Hudson about her Blue Helix series. The first 2 books in the Blue Helix series, those are Sleepwater Beat and Sleepwater Static. These are speculative fiction. They're young adult, sci-fi, LGBTQ plus literature, and a bit of dystopian future in there as well, and just a lot of really interesting elements to these 2 books. So please do join me on Tuesday for that conversation with Catherine. I hope you had a wonderful week. If you watched Hamilton today and it was your first time or your 50th time, I hope you enjoyed the heck out of it. If you are doing something for the 4th of July, please, please, please be safe. This year, we not only have to worry about fireworks and crazy intoxicated people and crazy intoxicated people with fireworks, but we also have to worry about the second wave, the continued first wave, the whatever we're calling it, the coronavirus. So please, please, please stay safe. If you are at all at risk, please stay home. And if you're going out, please wear a mask and social distance as much as you possibly can. Just please do stay safe. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. And, maybe instead of going out, you could stay at home and get yourself lost in a good book. Talk to you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.